How did the actions of one man prevent nuclear war? What was the real-life Star Wars? And was the United States secretly plotting a nuclear first strike against the Soviet Union? We'll answer all of those questions and more in a revealing episode of Journey Through Time.
This episode is brought to you by family history website findmypast.co.uk, where you can delve deeper into your family tree to really understand your relatives' wartime experiences.
How did the horrors of the world wars impact your family? What was it like to live through evacuation, rationing, and the Blitz? You can answer these questions and more by starting your family tree with Find My Past's records, maps, and timelines.
And listeners to Journey Through Time can take advantage of a very special offer. Visit findmypast.co.uk/journeythroughtime to take a free trial and claim 30% off their most popular subscriptions. That's findmypast.co.uk/journeythroughtime. Free trial auto-renews after 7 days unless canceled. Terms and conditions apply.
Welcome to Journey Through Time. I'm David Olusoga.
I'm Sarah Churchwell.
And today, Sarah, we're going to begin not with a quote from an historical document, but with a question. What were you doing, if you were around at the time, in early November 1983?
Well, I was around in early November 1983. I was in middle school in the suburbs of Chicago, which is where I grew up. I was at home with my family. I don't remember exactly what was happening around those dates, but in early November, at the age of 13, I would have been looking forward to Thanksgiving. I actually would have just been right after Halloween, so I was probably still, high on chocolate, I would imagine. What about you?
I was 13 as well. I have no memories of that particular period. It will have been winter. I lived in the northeast of England, so it will have been pretty dark. And the 80s were a strange time, so I was probably doing what 13-year-olds do.
Listening to depressing music.
Listen to depressing music and not wanting to go to school, probably. The key dates here are the 7th to the 11th of November. And to jog people's memories, those old enough, 1983 was 3 years into Ronald Reagan's first term as president. Margaret Thatcher was prime minister in the UK. The big music hits were Uptown Girl by Billy Joel and All Night Long by Lionel Richie. Whatever you were doing, something else was happening. It was happening behind closed doors and it was hidden from view. Because if you were around in November 1983, those days may well have been some of the most dangerous days in your life. Not that you knew it, not that anyone really knew it at the time. Because between the 7th and the 11th of November, NATO and the Soviet Union came terrifyingly close to starting an accidental nuclear war. And in these two episodes, we're going to tell the story of a forgotten military exercise, Able Archer 83. A military exercise, a war game that was misinterpreted by the Soviet Union, by the KGB, as the preparations for a nuclear attack. And it became so serious that Soviet bombers and fighters were literally on the runway, armed, ready to take off. Missile launchers left their bases and headed out into the countryside of East Germany. It was a moment, perhaps the closest moment in the whole history of the Cold War, that the world came to World War III.
It's such an incredible story, but what's so amazing about it is that almost nobody has heard of this story. Now, we like a story that people don't know well on Journey Through Time, but this one is one of global consequence, of literally apocalyptic, and yet almost nobody knows the story. I mean, it's really mind-blowing. And I knew a little bit about it, but actually, reading through your notes and learning really how close we came, it is mind-blowing. And yet, as you say, we know about the Cuban Missile Crisis, but we don't know about this story. It's unbelievable.
That's the obvious comparison. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 played out in public, in full view. Everybody knew what was happening. Khrushchev and Nixon inching away from disaster. But the fact that there was another nuclear near miss, much more recently, 1983, and that it was kept secret, and that documents are still being kept secret about this, it's really shocking.
And that people like you and me, who, as we just said, were living through it, we were completely oblivious that this was happening. With the Cuban Missile Crisis, everybody was locked to their television screens, their radios, trying to figure out, we were on the brink of war. But this was much closer to the brink. This was literally on the precipice, and nobody knew.
Yeah, it was kept secret at the time. Not only was it not made public, the leadership of NATO, the leadership of the United States, didn't know at the time how close they had pushed the Russians to triggering a real nuclear emergency. This story began to seep out after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. And there was a documentary on British television in 1990. And I remember watching that documentary and being absolutely astonished, being absolutely shocked by it.
So you found out about it much, much earlier than I did. I mean, it's incredible to think that it's been out there in one form or another for 35 years, even if the story is still emerging in the ways that you were saying, which I think we're going to talk about. But 35 years, and yet people still aren't talking about it. It's incredible.
And I think there are lots of reasons why it's not really become something that is better known. But that documentary, in some ways, it happened because in 1990, former Soviet agents were able to talk. And the key figure in the documentary I saw was Oleg Gordievsky, the KGB officer who was a double agent, who was feeding information to the British. And he was an interviewee in this documentary. And he talked about what he had seen in November 83 during Operation Able Archer. Now, Gordievsky died earlier this year. He was somebody that Gordon Carrera, our colleague from The Rest is Classified, knew. I actually met him as well, because a decade after that documentary, I was a young BBC producer and I was still obsessed by Operation Able Archer, and I persuaded my bosses to commission a documentary about what had happened in 83. And I went to a CIA conference in Berlin. I was 29 years old.
I didn't know they had conferences. I thought they were supposed to be more secret than that.
I think it was that euphoria at the end of the Cold War. It was the only conference, may still be the only conference, the CIA ever held outside of America. It was in the Teufelsberg mountain outside Berlin. The Teufelsberg is a mountain made of the rubble of old Berlin. After the Second World War, it was just piled into this mountain. And in the Cold War, NATO put on top of this mountain of rubble, the mountain of old Berlin, a listening station.
So, wait, let me get this straight. The CIA invited the BBC to come report on their conference that was taking place on the mountain that was created out of the rubble of Berlin after the Second World War.
Yeah.
It's a cliche to say you can't make this up, but you cannot make this up.
Well, I can't remember. I was 29 years old. I don't know how I possibly managed to get myself into this.
How did they say yes to you?
I have no idea. Now I think about it and go, my God, you were 29. How did you manage it? But at this conference...
Skills, man.
Yeah, I'm impressed by my 29-year-old self, because at this conference were former spies from CIA, MI5, and KGB. So the old enemies were all there together.
Was it scary?
What I remember is I'd been to lots of academic conferences, and this is the first time
Those are scary too.
Yeah, they were scary. But I'd never met spies before. And this is not an insult to my academic colleagues, but I think that was the cleverest group of people I'd ever encountered. And I was astonished by how bright everybody was. These people, CIA, MI5, KGB, they were in some ways the brightest people in their societies. And it was really, really impressive how amazing, how bright, how multilingual, how knowledgeable these people were. And Gordievsky was there. And so the guy I'd seen in this documentary 10 years earlier was there. And it was another moment when I was fascinated by what had happened. And whenever I got a chance, I asked people their memories of Able Archer. But there was another moment making that documentary back in my late 20s that I really remember, because I worked out that the BBC held something that had never been broadcast, which is the 4-minute warning. The actual 4-minute warning, the thing that had kind of haunted my childhood, this nightmare idea that when a war began, there was going to be an announcement on the BBC, because the British Broadcast Corporation morphed into the wartime broadcasting service in the event of a nuclear war, and the BBC would have announced the 4-minute warning that the country was under nuclear attack, that we had minutes until impact.
So it's ready, it's pre-recorded, it's in the can, and they can use it when necessary.
It's ready, and there was a part of the BBC that was on standby to do this. And this is a kind of pre-digital age. So I worked out this thing must physically exist. the 4-minute warning is going to be locked up in a cupboard somewhere within this great sprawling thing called the BBC.
Because it's an analog world.
Yeah, it's an analog world. It's going to physically exist. So I wrote loads of email. I think it was letters.
It wouldn't have been emails, yeah.
I think letters. It's such a long time ago. And I remember there was a back and forth, and it took weeks to persuade them to let me include in my program and broadcast in my program the 4-minute warning. And obviously there was loads of rules. They said yes in the end, but lots of conditions. They didn't want.
Because it's like the War of the Worlds. It's Orson Welles
in 1938. I didn't want to end my career by convincing everyone in Britain that there was a nuclear war. That would have been a very short career. So there was lots of conditions about how I could use it. And then this parcel arrived, and it arrived on my desk. I had to sign for it. Someone came into my office and said, "Sign for this." And inside this box were 2 commercial cassettes, the sort you could buy in the shops. One of the cassettes had a red felt tip circle coloured in red felt tip, and another little circle on the label on the cassette, and that said air raid warning. And the second cassette had a green felt tip pen circle, and that said all clear. And these were commercial cassettes. And what just shocked me, I was 29 years old, I'd lived through the Cold War, I was a historian, I was obsessed with the Cold War, was how amateurish it was. It was just so kind of low tech. It was just kind of low quality. And it made me just realize how fraught the Cold War had been, that I just imagined it would be so much more impressive, so much more high tech, that there was more to it. And it was commercial cassettes with air raid warning in felt tip.
Yeah. So it's kind of like a handmade quality to our defense system. Like it's like DIY defense.
Yeah.
And I agree. It is frightening actually. You think, there's going to be something more elaborate. You're going to feel more protected than a plastic cassette with a red dot on it saying this is bad.
It really, really shocked me.
Wow.
A British listener will understand what I mean. It was like the Cold War being fought by Dad's army. It just felt really...
I've lived here long enough to know what that means.
Yeah, really low tech. And it was horrific to put this thing in the cassette player on my desk in my office in the BBC and listen to the words that, had I heard them in 1983, would have been the last thing I heard.
And it turns out that you came incredibly close to hearing them, that we all did.
Yeah. And that's why this story matters, because we were closer to nuclear oblivion than we think we were. Now, this is a story that we know more about with each passing year because historians are pushing for documents to be released. The key historian here is a guy called Nate Jones, who I think is the hero among historians who've really fought this battle demanding freedom of information requests to get these documents released.
So more could still be coming. There could be stuff we don't know.
We know that there are documents, there are known unknowns. We know that there are documents missing. There are documents historians like Nate Jones would love us to see. But we're finding out more with each passing year. Information, of course, began to leak out after the fall of the Berlin Wall. But back in the 90s, and I think this answers your question, Sarah, about why it's not better known. What I felt, wanting to make programs about this, was that in the 90s, people wanted to look to the future. The Cold War was over. It was an age of optimism. We were talking about the peace dividend. Everything was going to be better. And so historians like me saying, actually, look back to the Cold War. It was worse than you think. It was more dangerous than you remember. I think the general mood was, let's move on. So I think this story became visible historically. The documents emerged. The people who'd lived through it gave testimonies at a time when people really weren't in the mood to talk about the Cold War. But to get into the story, I mean, this is a moment from the Cold War that reads like a Cold War thriller. It reads like a spy novel. To understand what happened in those days in November in 83, we need to go back to the 70s and the early 80s. There's a period in the Cold War before this, between about 1967 and 1979, which is called the period of détente. Détente is French for relaxation. Now, to me, the 70s didn't really feel very relaxed, but that was the phrase that was used.
And a pause in, nuclear brinksmanship also doesn't sound very relaxing, but it was comparatively relaxed.
Comparatively relaxed. What happened was Nixon and the Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev wanted to avoid another Cuban Missile Crisis. This was an age of arms reduction treaties. This was an age when the two nuclear powers understood that they had the power to destroy each other, and they were trying to avoid these flashpoints. So, for example, a direct link between the Kremlin and the White House was installed, the so-called red telephone, to try to prevent things escalating. But Underlying all of this was the philosophy of the Cold War. The phrases that are used to describe this, there's two, and they're both really bad. One of them is called the balance of terror, but the other is called mutual assured destruction, MAD, appropriately MAD.
For those of us who remember this time, I mean, that phrase was in common usage, right? It was like the war on terror or something. It was everywhere. It was mutual assured destruction. But we were young in the ways that we're saying. And so you know how young people, you grow up, you don't necessarily question the things that are all around you. And so there was this sense that a world that was organized on the principle of mutually assured destruction was kind of normal. I mean, that was just how things worked, was that everybody knew they could destroy each other. And because we were sane, we would decide not to destroy each other. And that was our definition of sanity. And from a different perspective, you kind of think, no, that's not a good definition of sanity.
Yeah. It is, like many things to do with the Cold War, it's crazy, but there is a crazy logic to it. The idea that both sides had enough nuclear weapons to destroy each other, which meant that the cost of an attacking your enemy would be your own destruction. Nuclear war was unwinnable, therefore, so the theory went, it was unthinkable. That was the idea, that there was safety in basically having a loaded gun pointed at your enemy, knowing that he had a loaded gun pointed at you. And that was supposed to be stability.
I mean, to be fair, a lot of American society still operates on that principle, right? I mean, there are still people who think that, precisely to use your metaphor very literally, that having a loaded gun makes them safer than not having a loaded gun. It is the same argument, actually. But as we're saying, it's brinksmanship. So instantly what happens is somebody gets a bigger gun, or somebody gets an itchy finger and pulls the trigger, or an accident happens.
Or an accident. Two things happened in the late 70s that brought the era of détente to an end. The first is that the Russians deployed the SS-20 intercontinental ballistic missile, which was a missile that disturbed NATO and America. It was mobile, it was carried on a huge launcher, a kind of enormous truck, and it was a concern to NATO. But the bigger thing, I think, was in 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. Now, if there's any rules to history, I think one of them is don't invade Afghanistan. I say this as a British person. Britain invaded Afghanistan in 1839, 1878 and 1919, and again with America in 2001. None of those wars went particularly well, and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan went really badly as well.
Going back through our memories of the 80s, there's a lot of pop culture references keep coming to mind from this story, because, of course, when you're a teenager, everything absorbs into your brain. And for me, this is just always the moment of The Princess Bride, when it says one of the classic rules is don't never start a land war in Asia. And that joke became so funny to me when I learned that there was an actual, that there was a reason for that is, and a lot of it was to do with Afghanistan.
Yeah, I mean, no one wins in Afghanistan. And what happened to the Russians is what happened to the British in the 19th century, is that they ended up in a guerrilla war. But this guerrilla war was one in which the Americans were channeling money and arms to the Afghans. But it led the Carter administration to bring an end to détente. Arms reduction negotiations were halted, and the Carter administration began to invest in new weapon systems and adopted a generally harder line towards the Soviet Union. But the real change was the Reagan administration, which began in early 1981. Now, you will remember, I guess, Reagan coming to office?
I do, actually. That was the first election that I have any active memory of. It was like as I was coming into political consciousness. And I am happy to say that for whatever reasons, my context made clear to me that I was not a fan of his, even as he came into office. And so people around me made it clear that this was not what we were looking for. And I remember the early Reagan years in all kinds of ways, in terms of this escalation of an aggressiveness in the ways that America was talking about itself. And as I was coming to understand my country, thinking, why are we being such jerks? Like, why do we talk like this? Why are people saying stuff like this? Because you're literally young enough to know that, you're being told not to speak like that to other people. Like, you come home from school and your parents say, that was rude. Why would you be rude to somebody? And then you watch the president do that. And now we're accustomed to that, unfortunately. But at the time, I remember it being a shock.
Yeah. Reagan had run on a platform that America had sort of lost its position in the world. And he was saying that America needed to stand tall in the world and confront the Soviets, not just have a period of détente, not just a standoff, but to actually try to roll back the power of the Soviet Union. And one of the first things he did was an enormous increase in arms expenditure. As a share of GDP, defense went to 6%. in the United States in Reagan's first administration. But what really shocked the Soviets was exactly what you were talking about. It was language. It was rhetoric. It was the way Reagan talked about the Soviet Union and talked about the Cold War. He used language that was very provocative towards the Soviets. And the view from Moscow was that this was a president that frightened them. And we know this now much more than we did then. And what was happening in the Soviet Union was much more opaque than it is. This is speaking with historical hindsight. But that tough talk that Reagan had run on in his campaign had effects that weren't known at the time. And the context here, I think, is that the Soviet Union was in effect losing the Cold War by the 1980s. They had managed to keep up with the West in terms of military technology all the way from the Second World War. They developed their own nuclear weapons. They'd produced high-tech jet fighters and jet bombers. They'd put the first satellite into space. They'd had all of these victories. But by the 1980s, the computing revolution and the economic strength of the West, of Europe and America, meant the Soviet Union was really, really falling behind. And that computer issue was really critical. I mean, you remember the 80s was the age when people suddenly had computers. You could go to a shop and buy a microcomputer.
The first commercial for Apple. So for listeners who've never seen this ad, although for all of us who were alive at the time, it's completely burned into our brains. And you can find it on YouTube. Everybody should look it up if you haven't seen it. The original Apple ad for Macintosh, for the first Macintosh, is explicitly about 1984, which is when it came out. So it's an Orwellian ad, and the setup is very simple. It's just that there are these kind of faceless worker drone people who are marching in black and white, and they are all being forced through this kind of factory scenario. And then they go into an auditorium, and there's a giant head on the screen, this big Orwellian kind of Big Brother, Wizard of Oz figure, who is intoning propaganda at them. He's just indoctrinating them, saying that we are one people and we shall prevail and we will defeat our enemies. And then this young blonde woman in garb that looks uncommonly like Olympic garb, and we had just had an Olympic situation at that point, which we'll come back to. She comes running in with a sledgehammer and throws a sledgehammer at the screen and breaks it open, and light falls forth, and basically like the shackles fall from the workers, and then the ad just says, "Coming soon, the Macintosh computer, which will make sure that 1984 will not be like 1984." Right? So the ad comes out at the end of 1983.
And it looks like, from the West, that liberation, this new technology is going to free us. It's going to be this exciting new future. From the East, knowing that you haven't got the computing power to match the West, it looks like a destruction of your system. It looks like an attack ad.
Well, because it kind of was, right? I mean, there's so much about this moment that's really, really uncanny. The ways in which popular culture seems like a kind of, I don't know, Geiger counter or something, to be kind of registering these tremors of this thing that we now know is happening behind the scenes. Because that Apple ad is it's as if it were designed to provoke Soviet fears. It's like they wanted to stoke their paranoia. And yet it had to be a coincidence unless we think Steve Jobs had like Soviet espionage. Yeah. I mean, which you might have.
He was busy.
I mean, he's a clever guy, but...
Looked at from the other side of the Iron Curtain, the computer revolution was terrifying. The Soviet general, Nikolai Orgakov, famously said, in the US, small children play with computers. He meant us.
Yeah, that was a little bit of an exaggeration. Most of us couldn't afford them yet, but we wanted them really badly.
Yeah. But he says, here in Russia, we don't even have computers in every office of the defense ministry. The Soviet leadership under Brezhnev understood that the next phase of the arms race, the new generations of weapons, were going to be all about computing power, and the Soviet Union was going to struggle to keep up, that they were slipping behind economically, but also militarily. And those new weapons were already beginning to emerge. And there was two missiles that absolutely terrified the Russians, and that, in their mind, put the whole idea of mutual assured destruction, the balance of terror, into question. If you were around in the 80s, you might remember the names of these weapons because they were controversial. There was the Pershing II missile and the Griffin cruise missile.
So as a teenage girl who was not paying attention to military armament more than I could help, I don't remember the Griffin cruise missiles, but I certainly remember Pershing II. That was in the news everywhere.
It was partly in the news because the deployment of those two missiles in Europe was a huge controversy. The Pershing II missile was to be deployed in West Germany, and the cruise missile was to go to a US base in Greenham Common in England. And the debate in Europe about these weapons arriving, the anti-nuclear organizations like the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament in Britain, this was the biggest campaign they ever run against the arrival of these missiles. Because I think everyone understood that this new generation of weapons changed things. But from the Soviet point of view, they were terrifying. The Pershing missile in particular unnerved the Soviet leadership because it was able to hit their command posts, i.e. where the Soviet leaders would be in a nuclear war, but it didn't have the range to hit the missile silos deeper in the Soviet Union. So it looked to them like the function of the Pershing missile, which traveled extremely fast and was right on their borders, right on the borders of the East and the West, the Warsaw Pact and NATO. It looked like the purpose of this fast missile was to attack and destroy and knock out, to use that horrible phrase, the Soviet leadership. It meant that they themselves were the target. Now, in the language of the Cold War, this was a strategy known as decapitation, that you tried to wipe out the leadership as a way of trying to win a nuclear war. And in the crazy logic or illogic, whichever it is, of mutual assured destruction, MAD, this was a first strike capacity. This meant that it took away the mutual part of mutual assured destruction. And it convinced some in the Soviet leadership and the KGB and the GRU military intelligence that the Americans were trying to find a way of winning a nuclear war.
All of that makes it very clear why they would be, totally freaked out. But as you say, there's a personal element to it as well. They're also just afraid they're going to get assassinated. We can present it as they're concerned about, nuclear war and the nation, but also it's like, well, what are we going to do if they come after us?
I think it is a factor that the Pershing missile looked like it was not just attacking their country, but actually them, that it was designed to kill the Soviet leadership. I think that must in some way have shaped their thinking. But we can see that thinking crystallizing early in 1981. In May of that year, there was a secret meeting of the KGB and the GRU, the military intelligence agency. It was convened by Brezhnev, the leader of the Soviet Union, and he handed over in this meeting to the head of the KGB, Yuri Andropov, who gave a speech in which he said that the Americans were getting ready to start a nuclear war. And to counter this, Andropov announced the beginnings of a new intelligence operation. And the purpose of that operation was to find evidence that NATO and the US were planning a nuclear first strike to knock out the Soviet Union before they could launch their missiles.
So they're basically operating from the position of a worst case scenario. I mean, they're not saying, well, let's try to find some middle ground or build up incrementally to some other solution. They begin with the presumption of the worst case and start planning from that premise.
They look at these new missiles, they look at the technology gap between American computers and Soviet computers, and they conclude there are enough indicators to believe that this might be an American strategy. But they also apply another Cold War logic, the idea of launch on warning, that you launch your missiles not when the enemy launches their missiles, but when you have enough warning to believe that they're going to launch their missiles. And this intelligence operation was called Operation RIAN. It's an acronym, a Russian acronym for nuclear missile attack. And it was designed to gather the information to justify the principle of launch on warning.
So you were talking earlier about when you met all the spooks. I still have this image of you meeting the spooks in Germany. So they're all out there gathering this information. Is there any evidence that there was any intelligence that could either confirm or deny? Because we're talking about the ways in which they were operating on a hypothesis, but was there any information that they were gathering that was confirming their worst fears?
Operation RIAN identified 292 indicators, sort of little warning signs that the West would inadvertently give away the fact that it was preparing for a nuclear war. And in every Soviet embassy, everywhere around the world, there were KGB officers attached, and they were assigned the task of gathering information on these 292 indicators. And some of them are really, really strange. So they were asked to monitor government buildings to see whether the light stayed on late at night, in case that was a sign of people working late because they were preparing for a nuclear strike. Of course, it could just be that the cleaners were in. Yeah.
They were working late trying to avert nuclear war. This is also possible.
Underground command bunkers where a war would be directed from, they were monitored. Spies looked to see whether people were coming and going from them. Who was coming in and out of 10 Downing Street was monitored by KGB officers operating in London. Where religious leaders were was one of the indicators. Russian agents in the UK were asked to look out for an increase in appeals for people to donate blood. Because the logic went that if there was a nuclear war, the number one injury, the most common injury, is burns. And the treatment of burns requires very large amounts of blood transfusions. So a blood drive, that was one of the indicators, according to Operation Rian, that the West could be preparing for an attack.
But also, you've just offered a beautiful description of how paranoia works, right? Which is taking all of these potentially problematic, but potentially innocent indicators, just normal life going on, and attributing the worst possible explanation to it, right? When people talk about paranoia, they refer to delusions of reference, which is that thing, when you walk past some people talking and they stop talking and you think they stopped talking because they were talking about you, right? And that's a paranoid reaction because you're assuming that everything is about the bad scenario that you're imagining, when in fact, they're probably not talking about you at all. They don't care about you. You're not important enough for them to care about you, right? They're talking about something completely different. And these are all delusions of reference, is that they're all convinced that because they think the West is out to get them, which in a sense it is, but it's not out to get them to the extent that lights on late at Downing Street is any evidence of anything, as we're saying, other than people working late at Downing Street. And yet when you get into a totally paranoid mindset, that's where you end up, is all of this is evidence to the thing I already believed was true. And it's pure confirmation bias at that point.
That's exactly what historians think is the fundamental flaw of Operation Rian. It began with a hypothesis, and it asked agents to go out and find evidence to prove the conclusion that they'd already decided, that the West was plotting a nuclear war.
This is why we teach the scientific method, because this is the worst way to approach evidence. Historians everywhere clutching their hair going, this is the wrong way to approach evidence. Also, police should be listening to this too. The wrong way to approach evidence.
But there were other elements of the way Rian was organized that made it even worse. The first thing was that these KGB operatives weren't asked to send their informed opinion. They were just asked to send information. The analysis was done by people in Moscow. So the KGB operatives who knew the West, who lived in the West, who had an understanding of what these societies were like, they weren't sending through detailed analysis. They were just saying, are the lights on at Downing Street? Has there been a blood drive? I mean, one of the craziest, I think, most amazing indicators in Operation Rian was the location of the original Declaration of Independence in Washington, D.C. Because what they decided was that if America was planning a nuclear war, the Declaration of Independence and other historic American documents would be taken out of the National Archives and put underground in some bunker. So there was some spook watching to see where the Declaration of Independence was. It was all of these indicators, the number of cows that were being slaughtered, whether the West was trying to...
That's when you know nuclear war is coming, if the cows start to get killed.
People would be stockpiling food. So they had all of these indicators, and the information is being sent back, not analyzed by people who know the West, but just as raw information. And also, these are military officers. These are GRU and KGB officers. They obey orders. They do as they're told. And also you are rewarded for providing this information, and you're punished if you don't. So everything about this system was almost kind of perfectly designed to build up fears and to create, to use the word that is a complicated word, but I think the right word, which is paranoia. Now, there were legitimate fears the Soviet Union had about the West, about the balance of power, who wouldn't be scared in the Cold War. I think it is also legitimate to use the word paranoia, and Operation Rian fed that paranoia. Oleg Gordievsky called it the intelligence cycle. People asked for information to prove pre-existing conclusions, and that information duly arrived and made those presumptions, made those conclusions seem all the more likely, all the more legitimate.
But instead of it actually being evidence confirming facts, it's just a vicious circle of self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah, it just built up and ramped up tension and paranoia and fear within the Soviet Union. And then on the 10th of November, 1982, Brezhnev, who had been General Secretary, ruler of the Communist Party and the Soviet Union since 1964, died. And the man who replaced him, just 2 days later, the man who took control of the Soviet Union, who took control of its 11,000 nuclear warheads, its army of 5 million soldiers, that man was Yuri Andropov, the leader of the KGB and the initiator of Operation Ryam. So the man who had created this cycle of paranoia was now the leader of the Soviet Union.
So who is Yuri Andropov?
Well, Andropov is 68, so he's the oldest person to take charge of the Soviet Union. The criminologists, the Russia watchers in the West, they didn't know very much about him, and there's a bit of a shock because he wasn't the obvious candidate. Rumours emerge that are sort of turn out to be wishful thinking. There is this idea that he is someone who listens to Western jazz music, and he drinks cognac, and he reads Western spy novels. None of that turns out to be true. What we know about Andropov is that he was a Communist Party member from being a teenager. He survived Stalin's purges in the 1930s, the so-called Great Terror. And through all of that, he not only survived, he stayed loyal to the party. By the 1950s, he's become the Soviet ambassador in Hungary. And in 1956, he plays a really important role in the suppression of the Hungarian Revolution. Andropov is still known among some people in Hungary as the Butcher of Budapest. There's an account of that moment by Christopher Andrew, the great British historian of the Cold War, and he said that Andropov watched from the windows of the Soviet embassy as members of the Hungarian secret police were literally strung up, hanged from lampposts by Hungarian crowds. And that experience just showed him and just how quickly communist states can suddenly lose control, and it never left him. He'd been the head of the KGB from 1967 onwards, and when he became leader of the Soviet Union, like his predecessor, like those who would follow him, he's an absolute ruler, and he is the person who is going to take the Soviet Union and the world through what is going to be the most bleak, the most dangerous, and the most tense year of the Cold War, 1983.
So 1983, we have Andropov, former head of the KGB, the Butcher of Budapest, diehard loyalist in charge of the Soviet Union. And we have Reagan in the United States, who is, speaking for myself, indulging in provocative, warmongering, saber-rattling rhetoric. So it's all going to go very well from here out, isn't it?
That's exactly the issue about 1983. It is a dangerous year because of the changes in technology, but what makes it particularly dangerous is not what is done, but is what is said. It is a year of dangerous speeches. Andropov starts this in January, just 2 months into the job. He gathers together the leaders of the Warsaw Pact, the Eastern European nations dominated by the Soviet Union, the nations on the other side of the Iron Curtain, and he warns them that the Pershing II missile and the cruise missile, that they are indicators that America no longer was following a policy of mutual assured destruction, but may well be planning for a first strike against the East. And then 2 months later, Reagan, on the 8th of March, gives one of the most famous speeches in the whole of the Cold War. I don't know if you remember this speech?
I do remember this speech, absolutely. This is the speech where Reagan described the Soviet Union as it's how we started calling them the evil empire. He called the Soviet Union the focus of evil in the modern world. And across the United States, then the Russia just started, probably was called the evil empire before then, but it kind of gave it the seal of approval in this sense that it was the focus of evil. It was the enemy. They were the bad guys.
The Evil Empire speech.
The Evil Empire speech, yeah.
Yeah. And just 2 weeks later, on the 23rd of March, Reagan gave another speech, which again, you might remember, or you might remember how it kind of changed the culture. He was speaking from the Oval Office, and he announced what was called the Strategic Defense Initiative.
I completely remember that. It was otherwise known as Star Wars. And of course, in 1983, it's 6 years after the first Star Wars, as I will always call it. Star Wars fans, you can send me postcards, I will ignore them. Empire Strikes Back. And so...
what our generation called the real Star Wars.
The real Star Wars. I will continue to call them the real Star Wars movies. And so, of course, the press latched onto it because it was this idea that you could fight battles in space. And so it sounded like Star Wars coming to real life. The science science fiction was actually going to happen, that take the arms race into space.
Yeah, that you could shoot down intercontinental ballistic missiles with multiple warheads using lasers and mirrors and satellites in space. Now, it was completely impractical and unfeasible for the technology of 1983, but it terrified the Soviets because, again, it undermined, like the missiles, Pershing II and Cruise, it seemed to undermine the whole principle of mutual assured destruction. But also, in the age where the Soviets didn't have the computing power to compete, here was the Cold War going into space. You've kept up with the nuclear arms race. You kept up with the missile race. The Soviets know they didn't have the economy and or the technology to compete. Another escalation, another round of the arms race if the Cold War went into space.
Now, I might be misremembering this, but I have a very strong recollection of even the American press at the time saying, or certainly Reagan's critics, maybe it was his political opponents, I remember knowing that we didn't have the technology, that we weren't there. And yet, it was persuasive enough to convince Andropov and the Russians that they needed to be very worried about it, even if I'm remembering correctly, a 13-year-old girl outside of Chicago knew that we did not, in fact, have the technology. As I say, I might be misremembering, but it's again that breakdown of intelligence, right? That he's absolutely believing all of the worst possible scenarios when all the ordinary people in America are going, well, this is silly. Reagan's full of shit.
I mean, there was lots of discussions and lots of people in the defense establishment were horrified by the announcement of the Strategic Defense Initiative. And there was lots of discussion about it not being feasible. 4 days after Reagan announced the SDI, the Star Wars program, Andropov gave an interview to Pravda in which he said that the purpose of this new program was for the Americans, quote, to achieve military superiority over the Soviet Union. So the new missiles, now the Cold War going into space, that what the Soviets concluded was the Americans had come to the conclusion that you could, if you struck fast enough, you could win a nuclear war. And it wasn't just the Soviets who were freaked out by this. There was a poll carried out of American public opinion at the end of 1983, and 47% of Americans concluded that Reagan's policies had brought the world closer to nuclear war.
Well, and as history would prove, they were correct, right? As soon as you mention, 1983 in America and American geopolitics broadly, the first thing that I, and I think probably most Americans of my generation remember, is the end of March 1983. I was in school, naturally, and because it was like the middle of the day, and an announcement came over the loudspeakers that Reagan had been shot. And I think we stayed in school. I have no memory of being sent home. But they just said they would kind of keep us updated because I think they said we knew pretty quickly that he hadn't been killed. But we also knew that there had been serious injuries, including his press secretary, Jim Brady. And I remember going home that night and my mother talking to us about JFK's assassination and how for her generation it was such a defining moment that everybody knew where they were when JFK was assassinated. And she said, you're always going to know where you were when Reagan was shot.
And she was right.
She was right. I mean, the defining moment for our generation probably was 9/11 much more than Reagan's shooting. But I think partly she helped make that happen by saying that to me. But yeah, of course, you remember
so
hearing that
it was announced in your school?
It was announced over the loudspeaker in school.
Really?
Yeah.
Can you remember your reaction?
Not really. I mean, just the disbelief you would expect and not being able to take it in, not really understanding what that might mean. But I do think I remember also that they very quickly said he was alive. So then it didn't feel that frightening. It was bad, but he was alive. They said it's going to be okay. So you sort of go, okay, well, that's scary, but okay. But I don't have a clear memory of my reaction to it. I just remember hearing it. And of course, the shock and all the kids instantly, chattering at each other, trying to make sense of it as kids do. But yeah, no, I don't remember having a clear thought process about it.
But it is one of those other details you can almost forget that in the middle of all of this craziness, and we're going to paint a picture of just how dangerous and crazy 1983 was, we almost forget, it's almost an incidental detail, that Reagan was shot in the middle of all of this.
Now, the other thing that's worth bringing in here, because I said I'm going to keep bringing in pop culture from 80s America because this is my memory of the time. Also in March 1983, a movie came out that I loved, and we all loved, my whole generation really loved, which starred Matthew Broderick, who some of our listeners will know. He went on to star in Ferris Bueller's Day Off, an iconic film of my youth, set in my hometown, by the way. But in 1983, he made the movie that made him a star, and it came out in the spring of 1983, right around this time, which was War Games, which is a movie about a kid who almost accidentally starts nuclear war with Russia by playing with computers. So there are these moments in this story where it's like people were sensing what was happening behind the scenes. I mean, it's uncanny that this incredibly popular film comes out that basically imagines a teenager causing exactly the same crisis that is about to be precipitated.
Yeah, it's a movie about accidentally triggering a nuclear war.
With computers.
A movie that concludes that nuclear war can't be winnable. A movie aimed at kids that in some ways shows that the principle of mutual assured destruction is crazy. And this is one of the biggest movies of the year. And it's released in a year where we come closer to nuclear war than perhaps any year in the Cold War. Now, we know that Reagan watched war games as well. I mean, wasn't aimed at elderly presidents.
It was aimed at me, and it worked.
But he watched it. It had a huge impact. I think it shows in the point you're making, which is that even though the story we're telling is about top secret events that were taking place behind closed doors in the intelligence community within the military, that culturally it was seeping out. It was kind of present in the culture, in the movies, in the phrases people used, in the songs that were being written at the time.
Because we could all figure out in one sense the same thing that Andropov and the Soviet leadership could figure out, which is that for all the reasons you're saying, there are these speeches, there's this evidence, everybody can see around them that we could be close to the brink, and that's exactly what starts to panic the Soviet leadership.
Yeah. The world was getting more dangerous. And even those who weren't privy to the information, even within the culture, you could kind of sense that it was ramping up. But that's what's visible. That's what people know. What people didn't know, what the government wasn't told, is that the Reagan administration had also launched a psychological military warfare program, a PSYOPs program against the USSR. And that also had an incredibly dramatic effect on making the Soviet leadership even more fearful about the intent, about the ambitions of the Americans. Psychological warfare, PSYOPs, was designed to confuse and disorientate them. It was designed to make them not knowing what the next move was going to be by the Americans, what their intentions were, what their strategies were. And there are a series of PSYOPs through 1983 that really frighten the Russians. In March 1983, there is a naval exercise called Fleet X 83, a huge exercise of aircraft carriers and submarines and other vessels in the North Pacific. In May 83, American aircraft carriers and other ships are sent towards the Kamchatka Peninsula in the far northeast of the Soviet Union. Throughout the year, there are simulated bombing runs where American fighters and bombers fly towards Soviet airspace and then turn away, veer off at the last minute. They light up the Soviet air defense systems, the radar, and then...
So they're playing chicken. That's what we call it.
They're playing this incredibly provocative game. Now, Reagan had said that America needed to stand tall in the world, that they needed to roll back the Soviet Union, not just stand up to the Soviet Union. But when you think about this now with what we know about what was happening inside the mentality of the Soviet leadership, this was adding to the belief, the growing belief, that the Americans were planning a first strike, that the Americans no longer believed in the mutual part of mutual assured destruction.
This is the danger of playing mind games, isn't it? Is that, you think you can just provoke them in ways that are predictable to you or that will have the desired outcome that you're looking for. But mind games, by definition, are unpredictable. You get in their minds, but you don't know how they're going to react. You don't know what they're going to do next. So they successfully got into their minds, but with disastrous consequences.
Exactly as you say, it had absolutely disastrous consequences. The overflights over Soviet territory had led Andropov to issue what historians have called the shoot-to-kill order. When American planes had not been intercepted in the past, there'd been a purge of Soviet pilots and officers in that part of Russia, and this was not to be tolerated again. And that shoot-to-kill order, aimed at reconnaissance flights or to intercept fighters coming towards Soviet territory, that had disastrous consequences. On the 1st of September 1983, a flight engineer on a Korean 747, a civilian airliner, ironically for a Cold War story called KAL 007, he probably, it seems, incorrectly entered coordinates into the system, the navigation system of that plane. And the plane, during the flight, accidentally entered Soviet airspace. It enters a part of the Soviet Union where there had been a failure to intercept American reconnaissance flights earlier that year. The Soviet Air Force had been purged as a result of that failure, and the shoot-to-kill order had been issued. And so this plane, this civilian airliner with 269 people on board, was shot down by a Soviet fighter. 2 air-to-air missiles were fired at a 747, a Boeing, a plane full of people.
It's one of those moments, isn't it, though, that shows how dangerous these scenarios of such heightened tension are, isn't it? Because it means that there's no room for mistakes. There's no room for human error. One engineer puts in the wrong coordinates and 269 people die. But as a result of the mind games that the Soviets and the Americans are playing with each other as they try to chase, some chimera of winning some contest that they've created for themselves. And all of that means that there is no room for simple human mistakes.
That's exactly what happened. I mean, do you remember the shooting down of the Korean airline?
I don't actually, and I'm ashamed of myself that I don't, because I feel like I should remember the downing of a major commercial airline. But there was a lot going on that year, and maybe it passed me by.
Yeah, I mean, the reaction of the Reagan administration was to say it was an act of barbarism.
That's rich.
Without any reference to the fact that there had been these previous overflights over Soviet territory. So
they were never going to admit culpability, were they?
No. But the fact that it was linked to Cold War tensions was put aside, and it was just put down to Soviet barbarism. This is September. We've had speeches, we've had psyops. The tensions in the year were growing and growing and growing. And 25 days later, another incident takes place, one that we didn't know about at the time. On the 26th of September, the Soviet nuclear early warning system detected the launch of 5 American intercontinental ballistic missiles heading towards the United States. This seemed like the American first strike, exactly what the Soviet Union's leadership had feared, exactly what Operation Ryan had been invented to detect. The launch indication flashed up at the Soviet Command Center, and on duty that day was a 44-year-old lieutenant colonel in the Soviet air defenses, Stanislav Petrov.
Stanislav Petrov is a man who deserves to be remembered by all of us. We all owe him a profound debt of gratitude, don't we?
He is one of the 2 heroes in this story, and this is not a story overburdened with heroes. What Petrov was supposed to do in that nightmare scenario was to report incoming American missiles to his commanding officers. And that would give them and the Soviet leadership, this would go direct to Andropov, minutes to decide whether to launch retaliatory nuclear strikes against the United States. That's what he's supposed to do. That's protocol. But instead, Petrov makes a decision that may well have saved literally billions of lives. He decides to do nothing.
In a split second. He has seconds to decide.
He's breaking protocol. He's effectively disobeying orders. He doesn't report it up the chain of command because he suspects it's a false alarm. He doesn't know it's a false alarm. He just thinks. He said he had a gut feeling that it was a false alarm. Now, we'll never know what would have happened if he had done what he was supposed to do, what protocol demanded that he did, and report the launch up the chain of command. But he just knew something wasn't right, and he waited for other corroborating information to come through, and it didn't. And it was a false alarm. We think that the Soviet nuclear early warning system was triggered by sunlight reflecting off high altitude clouds. That is what could have ended human life on Earth if it hadn't been for Stanislav Petrov.
Do you remember the song in English? It was called 99 Red Balloons. I loved that song. It is a German song originally. My German is terrible, so German listeners will have to forgive me, but I will at least say it, that it's 99 Luftballons.
Yeah.
And I was reminded, reading your notes about Petrov, it is uncannily like 99 Red Balloons. And I thought, I wonder what year that song came out, because I just remember it being from around then. And so I checked, and guess what? It's 1983. And that is a song about some innocent young people in love who let their balloons loose and they fly up into the sky, and it triggers off early warning detection, and nuclear warfare follows because they're on the brink of war. And this is what we've been training for. I've got the lyrics in my head. And then at
this is it, boy, this is war.
This is it, boy, this is war.
See, the lyrics are in there.
They're in there because our brains were so plastic, David. We could retain everything. I can do all of 99 Red
But
Balloons.
it was terrifying.
It was terrifying.
We were both the same age. We were both 13, and it was terrifying. These films, war games, these songs, I remember them word for word. I remember all of the imagery because it was kind of more than culture. It was culture reflecting the fact that we were living on the edge. It was terrifying. And I didn't understand the science behind nuclear war. I just really understood I was living in a time that was not normal.
And this is why I think the pop culture references are so interesting, because you say it's that everybody registered this. And that's why it's coming out through like the pores of all of our cultures, because, you know, a German singer recognizes it, an American filmmaker recognizes it. Everybody can see that we're teetering on the brink. And in fact, in the very year that they're all having these fears, we were.
Yeah. All of these things that are reflecting in the culture, they don't know about. We don't know about these psyops. We didn't know about Stanislav Petrov, but somehow it was kind of through some sort of cultural osmosis. It was reflected in the songs that were sung and the films that were made. But we remember what it was like in 1983 to be in your case outside of Chicago, in my case in the north of England. For the people of the Soviet Union, it was even more terrifying because that belief in the Soviet leadership that the West was seriously considering a nuclear first strike, that filtered down into their lives. Now, obviously, they're going to be suspicious about things you hear from the government. They are a long time since 1917. They understand that you take with a very big pinch of salt what the Soviet leadership tells you, but it is everywhere. And Dropov wrote an article that autumn in Pravda in which he said, it is time that the US stopped devising one option after another in search for the best ways of unleashing nuclear war in the hope of winning it. Engaging in this is not just irresponsible, it is insane. Now, that is a very true thing to say, but he is also at the same time running an operation desperately searching for evidence to justify a strike on warning, a retaliatory action. He's absolutely right to say it's insane, but the insanity is on both sides, but it is filtering down. There are civilian defense measures in schools. People are being taken to the underground bunkers that they would go to in the event of a war. It is part of people's lives in the East as well as it is in the West.
And as you say, what Dropov is saying is perfectly true, but it is still stoking fear as well. It is still increasing the tension, increasing the paranoia, the sense that this is all about to go terribly wrong. And that is the kind of atmosphere that does lead people at times to make poor decisions.
Yeah. And Dropov in that article spreads the fear, the belief that the Americans are considering a first strike, that they want to start a war. He spreads it from the Soviet elite down to the Soviet people. He makes it part of everyday conversation. There is evidence that people were actively being told, that party members were being gathered together in special sessions to be told that they were on the brink of nuclear war. One indicator, we've talked about the Russians looking at the West for indicators. One of the indicators NATO noticed of how bad tensions were was that in the autumn of 1983, something didn't happen that almost always did happen, was that the Soviet military took part in the gathering of the harvests. Very agrarian society. The Soviet military were not allowed to leave their bases in the harvest of 1983 to help gather the crops, and NATO spotted that as a sign of escalated tensions.
So we're at a moment where, as you say, tensions are escalating. They're really at a level we haven't seen since the Cuban Missile Crisis 20 years earlier. What happens next?
Well, this is a moment when the world, I think really, as you say, is on the brink, a world in a situation that it hasn't seen since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And at that moment, Yuri Andropov becomes seriously ill. Now, his health wasn't great to begin with. He was in his late 60s. So in late October 1983, a month after the false alarm in the Soviet defense system, he returns from holiday in Crimea. And instead of going back to the Kremlin, he travels to a facility in the forests outside Moscow, the Kuntesov Clinic, which is sometimes known as the Kremlin Hospital. And from there, from a hospital room in this exclusive Moscow hospital reserved for the party elite, Andropov continues in between dialysis treatment for his failing kidneys to rule the Soviet Union and fight the Cold War. He disappears from public view. His medical condition is kept secret from the Russian people, but he is in hospital, and he never, in fact, leaves the hospital. He never goes back to the Kremlin. He gets thinner and paler and weaker, and it is from his hospital rooms that he has to go through the most dangerous, the most tense moment of the Cold War.
What could possibly go wrong?
Andropov's hospital room becomes the nerve center for the Cold War. The Politburo members, the members of the communist cabinet, as it were, they drive out from Moscow through the forests in their black, shiny ZIL limousines with their military escorts through a series of checkpoints to have meetings with Andropov. He is dying, but he is still in control. And so on the 7th of November, 1983, with Andropov's health worsening by the day, with Soviet agents all over the world feeding in constantly information into this paranoid Operation Rian, with tensions between East and West rising because of the American PSYOPs, because of the Korean airliner, and with the new American missiles, Pershing II and Cruise, due to arrive that month in their bases in West Germany and England. On that day, NATO begins its annual military exercise, codenamed Operation Able Archer, an operation that is different enough in 1983 to the way it had been run in earlier years that it pushed the world to the brink of nuclear war.
So, on that note, we'll say goodbye for this episode, and please join us next time on Journey Through Time to learn what happened with Able Archer 83.
Thank you for listening.